For 72 years, the Bellevue-Stratford Hotel was the most prestigious address in Philadelphia. 15 presidents slept inside its walls. A queen arrived with an entourage of 19. Thomas Edison personally designed its lights. But in the summer of 1976, something inside the building began killing the people who walked through its doors. 29 would die. Over 180 would be hospitalized. And for 6 months, no scientist on Earth could explain why. The answer, when it finally came, was hiding in the last place anyone thought to look: the hotel's own air. Chapter 1. The dishwasher who would build a palace. In 1864, a 13-year-old boy stepped off a ship in New York Harbor with no money and no English, and within 40 years he would own the most famous hotel in America. His name was George Carl Boldt. He came from the island of Rügen, a wind-scoured stretch of land off the Prussian coast, where his father worked as a small farmer and his mother kept house in rooms that smelled of salt and damp wool. The boy knew 2 things when he arrived in America. He knew hunger, and he knew how to work. New York in 1864 was a city still bleeding from draft riots and war. The streets near the harbor teemed with immigrants who spoke a dozen languages and shared one ambition: survival. George Boldt found his first job washing dishes in a kitchen so hot that the walls sweated grease. He was paid almost nothing. He slept where he could. But he watched. He watched the way wealthy men moved through dining rooms. He watched the way they expected to be seen. And he began to understand something that would shape the rest of his life. Rich people did not simply want comfort. They wanted to feel important. He moved from kitchen to kitchen, learning English one order at a time, picking up the grammar of American ambition alongside the vocabulary of sauces and soups. By his late teens, he had worked his way from New York to Philadelphia, where he found a position at the Philadelphia Club, the oldest and most exclusive gentlemen's club in the city. The members were steel magnates, railroad barons, men whose fortunes could buy entire counties. George Boldt served them dinner. He memorized their preferences. He anticipated their needs before they spoke them. And he fell in love. Louise Carrer was the daughter of a prosperous Philadelphia merchant. She was educated, poised, and possessed of a social instinct that matched George's own. Where George understood ambition, Louise understood elegance. Where he saw opportunity, she saw taste. Together, they would become one of the great partnerships of the Gilded Age. But first, George Boldt made a spectacular mistake. He took Louise to Texas. The plan was a chicken farm. George had saved enough money to buy land, and the idea was simple: raise poultry, sell it to the growing cities of the South, and build a fortune from feathers and eggs. It was, by every account, a disaster. The heat was punishing. The chickens died. The money ran out. George Boldt, the man who could anticipate the desires of Philadelphia's wealthiest men, could not keep a flock of birds alive in the Texas sun. They came back east with nothing but each other, and a lesson George would never forget. He was not meant to work the land. He was meant to work the room. Back in Philadelphia and then New York, Boldt threw himself into the hotel trade with a fury that startled even his admirers. He managed small properties. He improved them. He turned modest establishments into places that people talked about. His secret was deceptively simple. He treated every guest as though they were the most important person in the building. Not with flattery, with attention. A guest who mentioned a preference for a certain newspaper would find it waiting outside their door the next morning. A woman who admired a flower arrangement would discover a fresh bouquet in her room by evening. These were not grand gestures. They were tiny acts of observation. I'm repeated 1,000 times until they created an atmosphere that guests could feel but not quite name. Word spread. The hotel world of the 1880s was small, and George Bolt's reputation grew fast. He was the Prussian immigrant who ran a dining room like a theater and treated a lobby like a stage. He understood something most hotel men of his era did not. The building was not the product. The feeling was the product. The marble and the crystal were just props. By the early 1890s, George Bolt had become one of the most talked about hotel managers in the eastern United States. He was charming, he was relentless, and he was waiting for the opportunity that would change everything. What happens when a man with this level of ambition is summoned by one of the richest families on earth? Chapter 2: The Waldorf and the Feuding Cousins. Two of the richest men in America despised each other, and George Bolt turned their hatred into the most legendary hotel on earth. William Waldorf Astor and his cousin John Jacob Astor IV shared a surname, a fortune, and an animosity so deep it reshaped the skyline of Manhattan. The feud was partly about money. Mostly it was about status. William believed he was the true head of the Astor dynasty. John Jacob believed the same about himself. Their mansions sat side by side on Fifth Avenue, and each man spent his days devising ways to humiliate the other. William struck first. In 1893, he demolished his mansion and built the Waldorf Hotel on its site, a 13-story monument to his own importance that cast a literal shadow over his cousin's home next door. It was an act of architectural spite, and it needed a manager who could turn spite into profit. George Bolt got the call. He arrived at the Waldorf and transformed it almost overnight. The hotel industry in the 1890s operated on rigid Victorian rules. Men and women entered through separate doors. Dining rooms were stiff, formal, joyless affairs. Hotels were places to sleep, not places to be seen. Bolt and Louise dismantled every one of these conventions. They introduced room service, an idea so radical that other hoteliers called it absurd. Why would anyone eat in their room when the dining room existed? Bolt understood the answer. Because privacy was a luxury, and luxury was what he sold. Louise placed fresh flowers in public spaces every morning, not because the rooms needed decorating. But because flowers signaled that someone cared about beauty for its own sake. Together, they invented the velvet rope, the simple device that turned an ordinary entrance into an event. If you had to wait to get in, the place must be worth entering. The Waldorf became the center of New York society within months. And then something remarkable happened. John Jacob Astor, watching his cousin's hotel thrive, decided to build his own hotel right next door. The Astoria rose beside the Waldorf, and Bolt brokered an extraordinary peace. The two buildings were connected by a corridor called Peacock Alley, creating the Waldorf Astoria, the most famous hotel in the world. The corridor was designed so that it could be sealed shut if the cousins ever resumed their war. They never did. Bolt ran the combined hotel with a staff of over 1,000. He hosted presidents, industrialists, foreign royalty. He introduced innovations that the industry would not fully adopt for decades. Printed menus, orchestras in the lobby, a concierge who could procure theater tickets or translate a telegram in 4 languages. The Waldorf Astoria under George Bolt was not merely a hotel, it was a social institution. The money followed. Bolt grew wealthy, then wealthier still. He bought a 1,000-acre estate in the Thousand Islands of the St. Lawrence River. He began building a castle there for Louise, a 6-story stone fantasy on Hart Island, with tunnels, towers, and a drawbridge. It was to be his gift to the woman who had shared his ambition from the chicken farm to Fifth Avenue. But Philadelphia called to him. The city where he had washed dishes and fallen in love had no hotel worthy of its history. New York had the Waldorf Astoria. Chicago had the Palmer House. Philadelphia, the birthplace of the Republic, had nothing that matched its own significance. George Boldt decided to change that. He began planning a hotel that the Waldorf could never be. Not a hotel built on someone else's spite. Not a hotel that bore another man's name. A hotel that was entirely, completely, irreversibly his own. The building he imagined would cost a fortune no sane investor would approve, and it would break his heart before it ever opened its doors. Chapter 3: $8 million and a Promise of Forever. When the Bellevue-Stratford opened its doors in September of 1904, it contained 1,090 rooms, 3 ballrooms, in Turkish baths, a rooftop rose garden, and a grief its creator would carry to his grave. The construction had taken nearly 2 years. George Boldt chose the corner of Broad and Walnut Streets, the crossroads of Philadelphia's civic life, where City Hall rose to the north and the Academy of Music held court to the south. The site alone cost a fortune. The building he placed on it cost another, $8 million. In 1904, that sum could have purchased a fleet of warships or built a small city from scratch. Adjusted for a century of inflation, it approaches $275 million today. Boldt spent it with the precision of a man who understood that every surface would be judged. He hired Thomas Edison to design the electrical system, not Edison's company, Edison himself. The inventor personally supervised the installation of over 10,000 light fixtures, creating a building that glowed from within like a lantern set on Broad Street. The stained glass came from the studio of E. Howard Godwin, each panel designed to filter Philadelphia's gray winter light into something warm and golden. The grand staircase was an elliptical sweep of hand-wrought iron that curved upward through the lobby like a frozen river of black metal. The ceilings in the public rooms rose 14 feet and were finished in 4 distinct decorative styles: French Renaissance, English Tudor, Colonial Revival, and Louis XV. Each ballroom had its own identity, each corridor its own palette. The Turkish baths in the basement offered marble steam rooms, plunge pools, and attendants who spoke in whispers. On the roof, his Boldt planted a garden, roses in summer, an ice rink in winter. Guests could dine among flowers 11 stories above Broad Street, looking out over a city that suddenly felt like it belonged to them. The Bellevue-Stratford was not just a place to sleep, it was a place to reign. But something had gone terribly wrong in the months before the Grand Dame opened. Louise Boldt died on January 11th, 1904. She was 42 years old. The cause was heart failure, sudden and merciless. George received the news in New York. He was 52, at the peak of his powers, weeks away from seeing his greatest creation come to life. And the woman who had shared every step of the journey, from the Philadelphia Club to the chicken farm to the Waldorf to this, was gone. The castle on Hart Island was still under construction when the telegram arrived. Over 300 workers were laying stone, carving arches, planting gardens on the island Louise would never see. George sent a single message: stop all work. He never returned to Hart Island. the castle sat unfinished for 73 years, its empty windows staring out over the St. Lawrence like the eye sockets of a skull. No roof was completed, no furniture was placed. The drawbridge was never raised. It became the most famous ruin in the Thousand Islands, a monument not to love fulfilled, but to love interrupted. George Bolt opened the Bellevue-Stratford in September of 1904. The reception was triumphant. The Philadelphia Inquirer declared it the finest hotel in the nation. Society columns devoted pages to its furnishings, to its kitchens, its guest lists. The Bellevue-Stratford instantly became the social headquarters of Philadelphia, the place where the city's elite gathered to see and be seen. Bolt managed the hotel with the same obsessive attention he had brought to the Waldorf. But those who knew him said something had shifted. The joy was gone. The ambition remained. The standards remained. The relentless eye for detail remained. But the man who had once lit up a dining room with his charm now moved through his masterpiece like a ghost in his own palace. He continued to run both the Waldorf Astoria and the Bellevue-Stratford for the next decade, shuttling between New York and Philadelphia, maintaining the impossible standards he had set. He died on December 5th, 1916, at 65. His heart, like Louise's, simply stopped. The Grand Dame he built would outlive him by 6 decades. It would host presidents from Taft to Ford. It would serve as the unofficial throne room of the city of Philadelphia. And it would carry within its walls, hidden behind the marble and the gilt and Edison's light, the seeds of its own destruction. No one was watching the water. Chapter 4. The City Within the City. Beneath the marble lobbies and behind the gilded walls, a hidden world of 700 workers, coal-fired fireplaces, and secret corridors kept the Grand Dame alive. Every great building has 2 faces, the one the public sees and the one that makes the first face possible. At the Bellevue-Stratford, the distance between these 2 faces was measured in inches. A guest standing in the main lobby, surrounded by 14-foot ceilings and Edison's golden light, was separated from a parallel universe by nothing more than a staff door disguised as a wall panel. Behind that door, the hotel breathed. The service corridors ran the full length of every floor, narrow passageways lit by bare bulbs where bellmen moved luggage, maids carried linens, and room service trays traveled from kitchen to guest room without ever crossing a public space. The building had 2 complete circulation systems, one for guests, paved in marble, and one for staff, floored in plain concrete. They existed in the same structure but never intersected. A guest could spend a week at the Bellevue-Stratford and never see a maid carrying a mop or a cook hauling a side of beef. That was the point. The theater of luxury required that the machinery of luxury remain invisible. The kitchen occupied most of the basement level. 50 cooks worked in shifts that began before dawn and ended well past midnight, producing thousands of meals each week from a space that functioned like a small factory. The Bellevue-Stratford's kitchen was famous for one dish in particular. Chicken a la king, that staple of mid-century American dining, was created here, or at least the hotel claimed so, with enough conviction that no rival ever seriously challenged it. The recipe called for diced chicken in a cream sauce with mushrooms and pimentos, served in a pastry shell. It was rich, it was indulgent, and it was exactly the kind of dish that a hotel built on spectacle would invent. The kitchen fed not only the guest rooms and the 3 ballrooms, but also the hotel's own staff dining room. where 700 employees ate meals prepared by the same cooks who served Philadelphia's elite. 700. The number bears repeating. The Bellevue-Stratford employed as many people as a mid-sized factory. Doormen, bellhops, switchboard operators, laundresses, plumbers, electricians, florists, musicians. The hotel maintained 2 full orchestras, one for the main ballroom and one for the rooftop garden. It employed its own stockbrokers, who maintained a small office on the mezzanine, where guests could buy and sell securities without leaving the building. On the 16th floor, a fully equipped hospital ward staffed by a physician and 2 nurses stood ready to treat any guest who fell ill, a service that most guests found charmingly excessive and would one day find tragically insufficient. The building generated its own electricity. A coal-fired power plant in the sub-basement ran generators that kept the Bellevue-Stratford independent of the city's power grid. When Philadelphia's lights flickered during storms, the Grand Dame glowed on. The hotel maintained its own water supply, its own heating system, its own laundry, its own carpentry shop. It was, in the most literal sense, a city within a city, self-contained and self-sustaining, answerable to no infrastructure but its own. This independence was a point of pride. It was also a vulnerability, because a self-contained building is also a self-contained ecosystem. And ecosystems, left unmonitored, develop their own inhabitants. On the roof, beyond the rose garden and the ice rink, stood a battery of cooling towers. These were the workhorses of the hotel's air conditioning system, installed decades after Bolt's death as part of a series of modernizations meant to keep the aging building competitive. The towers operated on a simple principle. Warm water from the building's cooling system was pumped to the roof, where it cascaded over a series of baffles and was cooled by exposure to open air. The cooled water then circulated back into the building, chilling the air that flowed through ducts and vents into every room, every corridor, every ballroom. The system worked well. It kept the Grand Dame comfortable through Philadelphia's brutal summers, and it created, in the shallow basins and wet surfaces of those rooftop towers, a warm, moist, mineral-rich environment that was invisible to every guest, ignored by most maintenance staff, and absolutely perfect for microbial life. No one tested the water in the cooling towers. No one was required to. No regulation existed that mandated it. The towers were mechanical equipment, not medical concerns. They sat on the roof, humming and dripping, doing exactly what they were designed to do. But something was growing in that warm water, something that had no name, something that thrived in exactly the conditions the towers provided. Temperatures between 77 and 108 degrees Fahrenheit, stagnant pools, mineral deposits that provided nutrients, and a fine mist that could carry microscopic particles into the air intake system, and from there, into every room in the building. The Grande Dame was breathing, and what she breathed was poison. Below, in the marble lobby, guests checked in. Bellhops carried luggage. The orchestras played. The cooks prepared chicken a la king. The doorman touched his cap, and the cooling system pumped air through a building that had no idea what it was circulating. The organism in the towers was patient. It had been patient for a very long time, and it was about to find its moment. Chapter 5. The Grand Dame Grows Old. The forces that would weaken the Bellevue-Stratford were already at work decades before anyone had heard of Legionnaires' disease. The first blow came from history itself. The Second World War changed what Americans expected from a hotel. Before the war, a grand hotel was a destination. After the war, it was a convenience. Returning soldiers and their families wanted clean rooms, reliable plumbing, and a parking lot. They did not want Turkish baths, rooftop rose gardens, or 14-foot ceilings in 4 decorative styles. The new hotels that rose along the nation's highways and at the edges of its airports were low, flat, efficient, and cheap to build. They had no hand-wrought iron staircases. They had no stained glass. They had no soul, and they were wildly profitable. The Bellevue-Stratford could not compete on price. A building with 700 employees, its own power plant, and 3 ballrooms carried operating costs that a Holiday Inn manager would have found incomprehensible. The Grand Dame's only advantage was prestige, and prestige in post-war America was a depreciating asset. The second blow came from within. In the 1940s and 50s, the hotel's owners undertook a series of renovations that they called modernization, and that history would call vandalism. The great Palladian windows on the lower floors, arched openings that had flooded the lobby with natural light since 1904, were boarded over and sealed behind flat panels. The reasoning was efficiency. Large windows were expensive to maintain and difficult to insulate. Flat walls were cheaper. The stained glass domes that Godwin had designed to crown the public rooms were coated in black tar during wartime blackout protocols. The tar was never removed. For 30 years, masterworks of American decorative glass sat entombed beneath a layer of petroleum residue, invisible to every guest who dined beneath them, their colors imprisoned by a decision no one ever reversed. Ornamental plasterwork was stripped from corridors. Carved moldings were covered with drywall. The Turkish baths, once a marvel of marble and steam, were converted to storage. Each individual change was defensible. Together, they amounted to a slow erasure of everything that had made the building extraordinary. Meanwhile, the infrastructure aged. The plumbing dated to 1904. The electrical system, despite Edison's genius, had been designed for a world of incandescent bulbs and manual switches, not air conditioning compressors and commercial refrigeration. The heating system burned coal in an era of oil and gas. Every year, the gap between what the building needed and what it received grew wider. Maintenance budgets were cut. Repairs were deferred. The philosophy was simple and ruinous. Fix what breaks, ignore what still works, and pray that nothing critical fails at the wrong moment. By the early 1970s, the Bellevue-Stratford was a building at war with its own age. The marble in the lobby still gleamed. The doormen still wore uniforms. The name still carried weight. But behind the walls, pipes corroded. Above the ceilings, wiring frayed. And on the roof, the cooling towers sat in their shallow pools of warm water, unmaintained, untested, and teeming. The hotel still attracted conventions. It was still the default choice for Philadelphia's political and social elite. The Grand Ballroom still hosted the city's most important galas, but the numbers told a grimmer story. Occupancy rates drifted downward. Revenue per room declined. The competition, once confined to a few rival hotels, now included dozens of modern properties with lower costs and newer amenities. The Bellevue-Stratford was living on reputation, and reputation, like the building itself, required constant maintenance that no one was willing to fund. Then came the warning that no one recognized. In September of 1974, the Independent Order of Odd Fellows held their annual convention at the Bellevue-Stratford. It was a routine booking. The Odd Fellows were a fraternal organization, their members mostly older men, their convention a mix of ceremonies, banquets, and committee meetings. They filled the hotel's rooms for several days. They ate in its dining rooms. They breathed its air. Within weeks, 20 attendees had developed pneumonia. 2 of them died. The cases were scattered across Pennsylvania. No one connected them to each other. No one connected them to the hotel. Pneumonia in older men was not unusual. The deaths were mourned, but not investigated. The Pennsylvania Health Department logged the cases and moved on. 2 years later, epidemiologists reviewing the Legionnaires' outbreak would discover the Odd Fellows cluster and recognize it for what it was: a dress rehearsal. The organism that would kill 29 people in 1976 had already killed in 1974. It had already proven that it could turn the Bellevue-Stratford's air into a weapon, and no one had noticed. The Grand Dame stood on Broad Street, her boarded windows and tarred domes hiding the damage beneath, her cooling towers humming on the roof, her aging pipes carrying water to systems no one inspected. She had survived 2 world wars, the Great Depression, and the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s. She had hosted queens and presidents and prize fights. But the thing that would destroy her was already inside. It had been inside for years, and it was waiting for a summer hot enough to bring 2,000 men through its doors. That summer was 1976. Chapter 6, 3 weeks before the fall. On July 4th, 1976, President Gerald Ford dined at the Bellevue-Stratford, and the hotel's occupancy stood at 84%, and everything appeared to be fine. America was turning 200 years old, and Philadelphia was the center of the party. The city where independence had been declared and the Constitution signed was alive with celebration. Tall ships sailed up the Delaware River. Fireworks lit the sky above Independence Hall. The Liberty Bell drew lines that stretched around the block, and the Bellevue-Stratford, the Grand Dame of Broad Street, stood at the heart of it all, gleaming in the bicentennial summer like a monument to the permanence of American institutions. President Ford's visit was a validation. The hotel had hosted 14 presidents before him, from Taft to Nixon, and Ford's presence at a bicentennial dinner confirmed that the Grand Dame still occupied its rightful place in the national hierarchy of importance. The Secret Service swept the building. The kitchen prepared a menu worthy of the occasion. The staff performed with the precision that George Bolt had demanded 7 decades earlier: 84% occupancy. In the hotel industry, that number represented health. The break-even point for a property the size of the Bellevue-Stratford hovered around 65 to 70%. At 84, the building was not merely surviving, it was thriving. The bicentennial had delivered exactly what the hotel needed: a surge of patriotic tourism that filled rooms and banquet halls and justified the cost of keeping 700 employees on the payroll. But the numbers masked a deeper fragility. The bicentennial was a one-time event. When the celebrations ended, the tourists would leave, the occupancy would drop, and the Bellevue-Stratford would be left facing the same structural problems that had been accumulating for decades. The burst of summer revenue was a bandage on a wound that required surgery. None of that mattered on July 21st, when the American Legion opened its 58th annual convention at the hotel. The Legion was one of the largest veterans organizations in the country. Its Pennsylvania department alone claimed tens of thousands of members, and men who had served in World War II and Korea, and, increasingly, Vietnam. The annual convention was part reunion, part political rally, part fraternal gathering. Delegates came from every corner of the state. They wore garrison caps and lapel pins. They shook hands and told stories. They drank in the hotel bar and smoked in the lobby and attended meetings in the ballrooms. Many were in their 50s and 60s. Some were older. Most had the chronic conditions common to men of their age: heart disease, diabetes, lungs weakened by decades of cigarettes. More than 2,000 of them filled the Bellevue-Stratford and the surrounding hotels and sidewalks. The convention ran from July 21st through July 24th. 4 days. 4 days of summer heat, pushing the cooling towers to maximum output. 4 days of warm water cascading over baffles and misting into the air intake. 4 days of conditioned air flowing through ducts and vents into rooms where men slept with their windows closed. The bacterium in the cooling towers had no brain, no intention, no malice. It was a rod-shaped organism, roughly 2 to 20 micrometers long, gram-negative, fastidious, and utterly indifferent to the grandeur of its host. It thrived in warm water between 77 and 108 degrees Fahrenheit. It reproduced by binary fission, and when aerosolized into tiny water droplets and inhaled into human lungs, it triggered a savage pneumonia that could kill a healthy adult in days. The conventioneers breathed the cooled air. They lingered in the lobby. They rode the elevators. They attended banquets in the ballrooms, where the ventilation system pushed air from the same rooftop towers into the same enclosed spaces where hundreds of men sat shoulder to shoulder. The organism entered their lungs. It found the warm, moist tissue of the alveoli. It began to multiply. No one felt sick during the convention. The incubation period ranged from 2 to 10 days. The delegates finished their meetings. They said their goodbyes. They drove or flew home to towns across Pennsylvania. And then, one by one, they began to fall ill. Ray Brennan was 61 years old. He was a retired Air Force captain and a bookkeeper for the American Legion's post in Luzerne County. He came home from the convention on July 24th, saying he felt tired. It was not unusual. Conventions were exhausting. He was 61. Fatigue was part of the landscape. But the fatigue deepened. A cough appeared. Then a fever. Then the fever spiked. His breathing grew labored. His wife drove him to the hospital. Ray Brennan died on July 27th, 3 days after leaving the Bellevue-Stratford. He was the first confirmed fatality of what would become the most famous disease investigation in American history. Within a week, hospitals across Pennsylvania would begin reporting a pattern that defied explanation. Older men, veterans, pneumonia, and a single haunting connection that no one yet understood. They had all been at the same hotel. Chapter 7. The Disease That Had No Name. By August 1st, 6 Legionnaires were dead, and the only thing connecting them was a hotel that no scientist could indict. The deaths came fast. Frank Aveni, a 60-year-old commander of the American Legion post in Pittsburgh, died on July 30th. Andrew Holt, a retired steelworker from Williamsport, died the same day. James Dolan, 61, a brewery worker from Philadelphia, died on August 1st. The names accumulated like entries in a wartime casualty report. Each man had attended the convention. Each man had developed a pneumonia so aggressive that antibiotics barely slowed it. Each man's lungs filled with fluid until breathing became impossible. Dr. Ernest Campbell was a family physician in Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania. In the first week of August, 3 of his patients presented with identical symptoms: high fever, dry cough, chest pain, confusion. 2 of them were Legionnaires. One was the wife of a Legionnaire who had not attended the convention herself, but had spent time in the hotel lobby. Campbell called the Pennsylvania Department of Health. He said 3 words that would trigger the largest disease investigation in the history of the Centers for Disease Control. He said there was a pattern. The health department acted quickly. By August 4th, state epidemiologists had confirmed that the cases were clustered among convention attendees. They alerted the CDC in Atlanta. The CDC dispatched its Epidemic Intelligence Service, a corps of field investigators trained to track outbreaks the way detectives track criminals. The EIS officers arrived in Pennsylvania carrying questionnaires, maps, and a mounting sense of urgency. The timing could not have been worse. In early 1976, a soldier at Fort Dix in New Jersey had died of swine flu, a strain related to the virus that had killed 50 million people in the 1918 pandemic. President Ford had authorized a national vaccination campaign. The country was already primed for biological terror. When news broke that a mysterious pneumonia was killing veterans in Philadelphia, the public reaction was immediate and visceral. This was the pandemic. It had arrived. The media descended. Newsweek ran a cover story titled, "Mystery of the Killer Fever." Time magazine dispatched reporters to Philadelphia and Atlanta. Television crews camped outside the Bellevue-Stratford. The Philadelphia Inquirer ran daily updates. Headline writers competed to find the most terrifying framing. Killer pneumonia, death hotel, the Philadelphia plague. The scale was staggering. By late August, the numbers had stabilized at a level that horrified the medical establishment. 29 dead, over 180 hospitalized. The victims ranged in age from 39 to 82. Most were men. Most were smokers. All had some connection to the convention or the hotel. The CDC mobilized more than 20 epidemiologists and dozens of laboratory scientists. It was the largest disease detection operation the agency had ever mounted, and they could not find the cause. Every standard test came back negative. The laboratories in Atlanta tested for every known pathogen that could produce pneumonia in clusters. Influenza, negative. Psittacosis, negative. Q fever, negative. Plague, negative. Tularemia, negative. The scientists tested tissue samples from the dead. They tested blood from survivors. They tested swabs from the hotel. Every culture plate came back clean. The absence of answers fed a frenzy of speculation. Television pundits theorized about nerve gas, biological weapons, poisoned food. Some suggested that the government was covering up a chemical weapons test. Others blamed the swine flu vaccine itself. A Philadelphia city councilman suggested that the deaths were caused by foul play and demanded a criminal investigation. The conspiracy theories multiplied in direct proportion to the silence from Atlanta. For the scientists at the CDC, the silence was its own torment. They were the best disease detectives in the world, and they were failing in full public view. Every day without an answer eroded the agency's credibility. Every death added another name to a list that the investigators carried like a weight. The organism that was killing these men did not grow on standard culture media. It did not show up in standard viral tests. It existed in a blind spot that the entire apparatus of modern microbiology had never been designed to detect. It was, in the most terrifying sense of the word, invisible. And while the scientists searched for what they could not see, the building where the deaths began was dying too. Chapter 8: The Hotel That Became a Crime Scene. David Fraser's investigation pointed squarely at the Bellevue-Stratford, and the hotel's lawyers told him they would destroy his career. Fraser was 32 years old, a CDC epidemiologist with a quiet manner and an analytical mind that processed data the way a jeweler examines stones, slowly, precisely, and without sentiment. He arrived in Philadelphia in early August with a team of EIS officers and a mandate to find the source of the outbreak. He did not care about headlines. He cared about numbers. His method was classical epidemiology, the same discipline that John Snow had used to trace cholera to a water pump in London more than a century earlier. Fraser and his team created detailed questionnaires and distributed them to every convention attendee they could find. The questions were specific. What hotel did you stay in? What room? What floor? What did you eat? Where did you eat it? Did you attend the banquet? Did you walk through the lobby? Did you stand on the sidewalk outside the hotel? How long? On which days? They gathered Sanborn fire insurance maps of the hotel and the surrounding blocks. They plotted the movements of every sick person and every healthy person they could identify. They compared the two groups obsessively, looking for the single variable that separated the dead from the living. The answer emerged with brutal clarity. The risk of illness was directly correlated to the amount of time a person had spent in or near the Bellevue-Stratford. Delegates who had stayed at other hotels but visited the Bellevue-Stratford for meetings fell ill at lower rates than those who slept there. People who had merely walked along the sidewalk outside the hotel fell ill at even lower rates, but they fell ill nonetheless. The disease radiated outward from the building like heat from a furnace. Fraser published his preliminary findings. The hotel, he concluded, was the common source. The reaction from the Bellevue-Stratford's management was immediate and furious. General Manager William Chadwick called the investigation a witch hunt. The hotel's legal team contacted Fraser directly and warned him that his conclusions were libelous. They told him his career would not survive the lawsuit they were preparing. They argued that the investigation was destroying the hotel's reputation based on circumstantial evidence. They demanded that the CDC retract its findings. Fraser did not retract. The numbers were the numbers. But the legal threats accomplished something more subtle. They introduced doubt. Newspapers reported the hotel's denials alongside the CDC's findings. The public, already confused by 6 weeks of contradictory information, did not know whom to believe. The investigation had proven where the disease came from. It had not proven what the disease was. And without a pathogen, the epidemiological evidence felt, to many, like accusation without proof. Inside the CDC's laboratories, the failure to identify the organism was becoming a crisis of institutional credibility. Teams worked around the clock. They tested for heavy metals, organic poisons, and industrial chemicals. They examined the hotel's water, its food, its carpeting, its ventilation system. Samples were sent to laboratories at the Army's Fort Detrick, to state health departments, to university researchers. Every test returned the same verdict: nothing. The problem was that the scientists were looking for what they already knew. Their culture media were designed to grow known pathogens. Their stains were calibrated to reveal known organisms. The bacterium hiding in the Bellevue-Stratford's water was not a known organism. It was something new, or rather, something ancient that had never been caught before. It refused to grow on the media that scientists trusted. It refused to stain with the dyes that bacteriologists relied on. It was, in every practical sense, a ghost. While the scientists searched, the hotel bled. The San Francisco Giants, in Philadelphia, to play the Phillies, refused to stay at the Bellevue-Stratford. The players threatened to sleep in Veterans Stadium rather than enter the building. Their refusal made national news. Within days, conventions began canceling. 30 of the hotel's 50 fall bookings disappeared. Tour groups rerouted. Business travelers chose competitors. Occupancy, which had stood at 84% on the 4th of July, crashed to 4% by September. Then 3. The hotel that had hosted 15 presidents was now housing fewer guests per night than a roadside motel. The damage spread beyond the building. Tourism across Philadelphia collapsed. Visitors canceled trips to Independence Hall. The Liberty Bell, which had drawn lines around the block during the bicentennial, stood in an empty pavilion. Convention organizers chose other cities. The disease had no name, but it had a geography, and that geography was Philadelphia. Inside the Bellevue-Stratford, the skeleton staff maintained the building as if guests were coming. Floors were swept. Linens were laundered. The doorman stood at his post, but the corridors were silent. The ballrooms were dark. The kitchens that had once served thousands prepared meals for handfuls. The Grande Dame was dying the only way a building can die, not from structural failure, but from abandonment. The answer was still months away. And the men who had the power to save the hotel were running out of time. Chapter 9. Auld Lang Syne at midnight. On the final night, the last guests and the last employees gathered in the hunt room, and at midnight they sang the only song that made sense. The decision to close the Bellevue-Stratford was not sudden. It was a slow suffocation. Through September and October of 1976, occupancy hovered at levels that could not sustain even basic operations. The hotel was spending more to keep its lights on than it earned from the handful of guests who still checked in. The payroll for 700 employees, the utility bills for a building with its own power plant, the insurance premiums for a property that had become the most notorious address in America. The numbers were impossible. Mayor Frank Rizzo, Philadelphia's blunt, outsized, larger-than-life leader, called the situation a sad and terrible thing. Rizzo was not a man given to understatement. He had built his career on bravado and confrontation. But the Bellevue-Stratford was personal. He had attended events there for decades. His political allies held fundraisers in its ballrooms. The hotel was woven into the fabric of Philadelphia's power structure as tightly as City Hall itself. When Rizzo called it sad and terrible, the city understood that something irreplaceable was being lost. On November 18, 1976, the Bellevue-Stratford Hotel closed its doors. 500 employees received their final paychecks. Many had worked at the hotel for decades. Bellmen who had carried luggage for 3 generations of Philadelphia families. Cooks who had prepared chicken a la king from the same recipe since the 1930s. Switchboard operators who knew the voices of regular guests before they stated their names. They cleaned out their lockers. They turned in their uniforms. They walked out through the same service entrances they had used every working day of their adult lives. The closing was not merely an economic event. It was the end of an institution. For 72 years, the Bellevue-Stratford had been the place where Philadelphia's deals were made, its marriages celebrated, its power brokered, and its identity performed. Its governors had been inaugurated in its ballrooms. Debutantes had been presented in its salons. The city's most important conversations had taken place over meals prepared in its kitchens and served in its dining rooms. When the hotel closed, it was as if someone had removed the living room from a house. The structure remained. The center was gone. On the final night, a small group gathered in the hunt room. The hunt room was the Bellevue-Stratford's bar and grill, a wood-paneled space where businessmen had lunched and politicians had plotted since the Eisenhower administration. It was the hotel's most intimate room, the place where the building's public grandeur gave way to something quieter and more personal. On this night, the last guests and the last employees shared the same space. The hierarchy that had defined the Grand Dame for 7 decades dissolved. Bellhop sat beside businessmen. Cooks drank beside guests. Someone ordered a round, someone ordered another. At midnight, they sang Auld Lang Syne. The Scottish ballad about old friends and the passage of time filled the wood-paneled room where decades of Philadelphia's history had unfolded. Should old acquaintance be forgot? The song asked a question that the building itself was asking. Would the city remember? Would anyone remember what this place had been? The doors closed. The lights went dark. The Bellevue-Stratford sat on Broad Street, locked and empty, its 1,000 rooms holding nothing but stale air and silence. Pigeons roosted on the ledges where guests had once sipped cocktails in the rooftop garden. Dust settled on the marble floors that 700 employees had polished every day. The building that had been a city within a city was now a carcass. The mystery of what had killed 29 people remained unsolved. 6 months of investigation by the most sophisticated disease detection apparatus in the world had produced reams of epidemiological data and not a single identified pathogen. The CDC's reputation was battered. Conspiracy theories flourished. Some people believed the disease had been a government plot. Others believed it had never existed at all. The absence of an answer had become its own kind of poison, corroding public trust in science and in institutions at a moment when trust was already in desperately short supply. America in 1976 was a country that had lost its faith in explanations. Vietnam had taught it that governments lied about wars. Watergate had taught it that governments lied about everything else. The swine flu vaccination campaign, plagued by adverse reactions and abandoned partway through, had taught it that even science could stumble. The Legionnaires' mystery fit neatly into this landscape of institutional failure. 29 men were dead, nobody knew why, and the building where it happened was locked shut like a tomb. But in a laboratory in Atlanta, a microbiologist named Joseph McDade was not finished looking. He had been assigned to the Legionnaires' investigation months earlier. He had tested for Q fever and found nothing. He had inoculated guinea pigs with tissue from the dead and watched some of them die. He had examined their spleens under a microscope and seen small clusters of rod-shaped bacteria that he had dismissed as contamination. He had moved on. The case was cold. Then December came, and with it, a Christmas party that changed the history of medicine. Chapter 10: The Man Who Refused to Stop Looking. A stranger's offhand remark at a Christmas party sent Joseph McDade back to his microscope, and what he found there changed medicine forever. McDade was a rickettsiologist, a specialist in the family of bacteria that includes the organisms responsible for typhus and Rocky Mountain spotted fever. He was methodical, careful, and possessed of the quality that separates good scientists from great ones: the inability to leave a question unanswered. The Legionnaires' investigation had been his assignment, and its failure was his failure. He had followed every protocol. He had tested every hypothesis his training allowed, and he had come up empty. The Christmas party was a routine affair, the kind of holiday gathering where colleagues and acquaintances make small talk over drinks. McDade was speaking with someone whose name he would later struggle to recall when the conversation turned to the Legionnaires' outbreak. The stranger made an offhand remark, something along the lines of, What a shame the CDC couldn't figure that one out. It was not meant as a personal insult. It landed as one. McDade went home that night thinking about the guinea pigs. Specifically, he thought about the ones that had died after being inoculated with lung tissue from the Legionnaires' victims. He had examined their spleens using a technique called the Gimenez stain, which was designed to reveal rickettsial organisms. He had seen clusters of small, rod-shaped bacteria, and he had dismissed them. The dismissal was logical. His cultures had been treated with antibiotics to suppress contaminant bacteria and allow any rickettsial organisms to grow. The rod-shaped bacteria he had seen could easily have been contaminants that survived the antibiotics. There was no reason to believe they were significant, unless the antibiotics had killed the very organism he was looking for. The thought struck McDade like a physical blow. What if the mystery bacterium was not a rickettsia at all, but a true bacterium, one that was susceptible to the same antibiotics used to suppress contamination? In that case, the standard protocol would have destroyed the evidence. The scientists would have been killing the answer every time they tried to find it. McDade returned to his laboratory in late December. He pulled out the preserved guinea pig spleen tissue. He prepared new cultures, this time without antibiotics. He inoculated eggs. He waited. The bacteria grew. He went back to his original slides, the ones he had dismissed months earlier. Under higher magnification, he found what he had missed. Not random contamination scattered across the field. A cluster of rod-shaped bacteria engulfed by a white blood cell. The cell was attacking the bacteria. This was not contamination. This was an immune response. The guinea pig's body had recognized the organism as an invader and had tried to destroy it. McDade grew the organism in pure culture. He tested the blood of Legionnaires' survivors against it. The blood reacted. The survivors' immune systems had seen this bacterium before. Their antibodies attacked it on the slide, the same way the guinea pig's white blood cell had attacked it in the tissue. On January 18, 1977, the CDC held a press conference. The organism responsible for Legionnaire's disease had been identified. It was a previously unknown bacterium, rod-shaped, gram-negative, and fastidious in its growth requirements. It was named Legionella pneumophila. It had been breeding in warm water and spreading through the Bellevue-Stratford's air conditioning system. The mystery was solved. The organism had been hiding, not in some exotic reservoir, not in some unimaginable source, but in the hotel's own cooling towers. Warm water, mist, ducts, and lungs. That was the chain. That was all it took. Joseph McDade had held the answer in his hands for months. He had looked at it under a microscope and dismissed it. He had killed it with antibiotics and not known. It took a stranger's insult at a Christmas party to send him back, to make him question the one assumption that had blinded him, that the organism would behave like something he already understood. For the Bellevue-Stratford, the discovery came 6 months too late. The building was already closed. The staff were already gone. The damage was already done. Science had solved the puzzle, but it had not saved the Grand Dame. Chapter 11. $25 million and not one night of profit. They spent $25 million restoring the Bellevue-Stratford to its original glory, and they lost every cent. The building sat empty for nearly 2 years after its closure. During that time, the discovery of Legionella pneumophila and the explanation of how it had spread through the cooling system provided the scientific closure that the public had demanded. The mystery was solved. The pathogen was named. Cooling towers across the country were inspected and treated. The world moved on, but the building did not. In 1978, a developer named Richard Rubin purchased the Bellevue-Stratford for $8,250,000. The symmetry was almost poetic. George Bolt had spent $8 million to build the hotel in 1904. 74 years later, its corpse sold for virtually the same figure in nominal dollars and a fraction in real ones. Rubin believed in the Grand Dame. He committed to a full restoration, an effort to strip away the vandalism of the 40s and 50s and return the building to something approaching Bolt's original vision. Workers removed the flat panels that had covered the Palladian windows. They scraped the black tar from the stained glass domes, uncovering colors that had not been seen in over 30 years. They imported carpets. They installed new chandeliers. They polished the marble that decades of neglect had dulled. The restoration was painstaking, expensive, and genuinely beautiful. The hotel reopened as the Fairmont in the early 1980s. Then it reverted to the Bellevue-Stratford. Then it was rebranded as a Westin property. Each name change was an attempt to outrun a reputation that no name could shed. Guests who had heard the words Legionnaires' disease associated them with one building, and that building stood at the corner of Broad and Walnut. Occupancy hovered around 55%. The break-even point for a property of this size and cost structure was 65 to 70%. The hotel never reached it, not once, not in a single month of operation across 7 years. $25 million in cumulative losses piled up like snow on a roof that no one shoveled. The restaurant struggled. The ballroom sat half empty. The name that had once been the finest in American hospitality had become a synonym for death. By the final months of operation, the hotel was hosting 10 to 15 guests per night in a building with over 1,000 rooms. The math was grotesque. An occupancy rate of roughly 1%. An entire floor of staff maintaining a building for a population that would have fit in a single elevator. The Bellevue-Stratford closed for the final time on March 7, 1986. The second death was quieter than the first. No chorus of Auld Lang Syne, no gathering in the hunt room, just a final ledger entry showing more money gone than would ever return. What followed was a transformation that acknowledged what the market had already decided. The Bellevue-Stratford could not survive as a hotel alone. A consortium of developers invested over $100 million to convert the building into a mixed-use property. The lower floors became retail space. The middle floors became offices. Only the upper floors retained hotel rooms, reduced from over 1,000 to 222, and operated first by a series of hotel chains and eventually by the Hyatt brand. The building survived. The hotel, as George Bolt had conceived it, did not. The Grand Dame that had once employed 700 people and operated as a self-contained city within a city was reduced to a fraction of its former self. A boutique operation occupying the top floors of a building whose identity it no longer controlled. The name Bellevue-Stratford, once spoken with reverence, had become something no amount of money could rehabilitate. It was not the building's fault. It was not Rubin's fault. It was the fault of an organism that no one had known to look for, growing in water that no one had thought to test, spread by a system that no one had imagined could be dangerous. $25 million had tried to buy back the past. The past was not for sale. Chapter 12. What the Grand Dame Left Behind. At the CDC Museum in Atlanta, A glass jug of chiller water from the Bellevue-Stratford sits in a display case, and it still has a story to tell. The jug is unremarkable. Clear glass, metal lid. The water inside is cloudy and faintly yellow, the color of old bath water. It was collected from the hotel's cooling system during the 1976 investigation and preserved as evidence. Decades later, it was donated to the museum, where it sits among artifacts of epidemiological history, vials from smallpox campaigns, documentation from the early AIDS crisis, equipment used to track Ebola in the field. The jug does not look dangerous. That is the point. The building still stands at 200 South Broad Street, Philadelphia. It is listed on the National Register of Historic Places, a recognition that acknowledges both its architectural significance and its role in the history of public health. The lower floors house shops and offices. The upper floors contain 222 hotel rooms, a fraction of the original 1,090, but enough to maintain the fiction that the Grand Dame lives on. The Grand Ballroom, the largest of the three that George Bolt built, still hosts weddings and galas and corporate events. The elliptical iron staircase still sweeps upward through the lobby. The marble floors, restored during the 1980s renovation, still gleam. Plans have been announced more than once to build a new ice rink on the rooftop, echoing the garden that Bolt planted in 1904. The plans have not yet materialized, but the fact that someone keeps proposing them suggests that the memory of what the building once was has not entirely faded. What the Bellevue-Stratford left behind extends far beyond Broad Street. The discovery of Legionella pneumophila in 1977 did not merely solve a medical mystery. It created an entirely new field of building science. Within years of the discovery, governments around the world enacted regulations requiring the inspection, treatment, and monitoring of cooling towers, hot water systems, and any building infrastructure that could harbor the bacterium. The warm, stagnant water that had bred freely in the Bellevue-Stratford's rooftop towers became a recognized public health hazard. New standards for water temperature, chemical treatment, and system maintenance transformed the way buildings were designed and operated. The CDC, which had endured months of public humiliation during the investigation, emerged from the Legionnaires' case as a household name. Before 1976, the Centers for Disease Control was a federal agency that most Americans had never heard of. After 1977, it was the institution the country called when disease threatened. The protocols developed during the Legionnaires' investigation became the template for every emerging pathogen response that followed. HIV in the 1980s, SARS in 2003, Ebola in 2014, and the pandemic that reshaped the world in 2020. And each of those crises was met by an institution whose methods had been tested and refined in the crucible of Philadelphia's bicentennial summer. Perhaps the most haunting legacy is this: Legionnaires' disease did not begin at the Bellevue-Stratford. Retrospective studies conducted after the bacterium was identified revealed that outbreaks of Legionella had been occurring for decades, stretching back to at least 1957. Clusters of unexplained pneumonia in buildings with older water systems were scattered through the epidemiological record, logged as mystery illnesses, filed as unresolved cases, and forgotten. The Odd Fellows Convention in 1974 was not even the first outbreak at the Bellevue-Stratford. It was merely the first one that left bodies enough to count. Legionella pneumophila was not a new organism. It was an ancient one. It had been living in water systems for as long as water systems had existed, killing people sporadically and silently, never in numbers large enough or patterns clear enough to attract sustained attention. The Bellevue-Stratford was not where Legionnaires' disease was born. It was where humanity finally learned to see what had been invisible all along. George Bolt built his masterpiece to be a monument to everything the eye could see. Marble quarried from the hills of Vermont, stained glass that turned winter light to gold, iron twisted into curves that defied the weight of the building above, ceilings that rose 14 feet because a boy who had once washed dishes in a kitchen believed that grandeur was a form of love. Edison's lights, glowing from 10,000 fixtures, turning the hotel into a beacon on Broad Street that said, "This is permanent. This is safe. This will last." It was destroyed by something no eye could find. A rod-shaped bacterium, 2 to 20 micrometers long, breeding in warm water on a rooftop, carried by mist into ducts, pushed by fans into rooms where men slept and breathed and trusted that the air was clean. The organism had no name. It had no intention. It had no awareness of the marble or the guilt or the stained glass or the grief of the man who built it all. It simply grew. The grandest buildings we raise are only as safe as the systems we never bother to look at. The Bellevue-Stratford proved that beauty without vigilance is a monument to our own blindness. And in a glass jug in Atlanta, a sample of cloudy water waits, patient and still, reminding anyone who looks closely enough that the invisible world does not care how magnificent our surfaces may be. It was always there. We just never thought to look.